The morning my son-in-law pushed me down the stairs, he grinned at me from the top landing and said, "Careful, old man. I want you to remember those words. My name is Jack Brennan. I'm 68. For 31 years I worked as a private investigator in Seattle until my wife, Ellen, convinced me to step away. We had dreams, the two of us. A small cabin in the Adirondacks, long mornings with coffee and nowhere to go. Road trips we'd been putting off since our daughter was small. Ellen passed 2 years ago last October. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After she died, I sold our Seattle house and moved into the place we'd always called the Lake House, a 4-bedroom craftsman outside Albany that Ellen had inherited from her parents. 2.5 acres, a dock that needed scraping every other summer, and a wood stove I'd grown to love more than any fireplace I'd ever owned. The property had last appraised at just over $1.3 million. I mention that number because it matters. It mattered to Mark from the moment he first saw the place. My daughter Lucy had been married to Mark Shaw for 4 years when Ellen died. He was 37, fit, handsome in a way that clearly cost money. And he worked as a commercial real estate broker in Boston. He wore his confidence like cheap cologne. Too much of it. And you noticed it before anything else. Lucy met him at a rooftop party in the Back Bay. When she called to tell me she was in love, I remember thinking her excitement sounded more like relief than joy. She'd been single through most of her 30s. Mark showed up at what felt like the last possible minute. I tried to like him. I genuinely did. He called me Jack from the start. Never Dad, never Sir. When Lucy wasn't in the room, his eyes moved around my house like a contractor's, measuring, assessing, assigning value. Once, almost casually, he asked if I'd updated my estate papers after Ellen's death. I told him I had a lawyer for that. He nodded slowly, the way people do when they're filing information away. "Smart," he said. "You want everything airtight at your age." At your age. I was 66 then. The fall happened on a Sunday morning in late November, 8 days before Thanksgiving. Lucy and Mark had come for the long weekend. I'd gotten up early to make coffee and light the wood stove. The stairs in the lake house are original wide oak with a slight bend at the bottom. I went upstairs to grab a book I'd left on the nightstand. Mark was in the hallway when I turned back toward the steps. He was in workout clothes, hair still damp from the shower, phone in hand. "Morning," I said. He stepped aside, and I moved past him toward the top stair. Then his palm, flat, quick, deliberate, pressed against the middle of my back. I went down 7 steps before the newel post stopped me. My left arm took the hit. I heard the crack before I felt it. I lay there at the curve of the stairs, breathing through the pain, and when I looked up, Mark was standing at the top landing, looking down at me with that same smile. "Careful, old man," he said. Then he called toward the kitchen. "Lucy, your dad slipped on the stairs. 2 broken ribs, a hairline fracture in my left forearm. That's what the emergency room found. The attending doctor asked how it happened. I said I slipped. I want to be clear that I said that on purpose. 31 years of investigative work taught me one rule above all others: never show your hand before it's full. Mark had done something criminal. I knew it the moment I looked up into his eyes from the bottom of those stairs. But knowing and proving are 2 different things. If I'd told the ER doctor the truth, Mark would have denied it. Lucy would have believed him, and I would have spent the next year in a family war with no witnesses, no documentation, no leverage. I'd been in enough courtrooms to understand the difference between being right and having evidence. So I smiled at the doctor, took my discharge papers, and started building my case. The first thing I did when I got home, arm in a brace, ribs taped, Mark making a show of carrying my bag, was call a man named Frank Marsh. Frank had worked under me for 11 years before opening his own security firm in New Hampshire. He was 52, quiet, methodical, and he owed me a professional favor neither of us had mentioned in 6 years. I called him from my bedroom while Mark and Lucy cooked dinner downstairs. I told him what happened. He didn't ask if I was sure. He just said, "What do you need?" I needed 4 things. Hidden cameras in my home without Mark's knowledge, covering the stairway, the main hall, the living room, and the front entrance. A financial deep dive on Mark, especially anything related to property searches or title checks in New York. A quiet call to my estate attorney, Marcus Webb, about whether anyone had recently inquired about my will or the property, and a complete background check on Mark himself. Frank said he'd have someone at the house within the week. He came himself. Mark and Lucy left on Monday. I gave Frank full access that Thursday. By Friday evening, 4 small cameras were running, one inside the smoke detector at the top of the stairs, one in the living room beam, one in the hall outside the kitchen, one above the front door. All linked to a secure cloud account only Frank and I could reach. The financial records came back 10 days later. Mark had, in the previous 4 months, run 2 title searches on the Lake House property. One through his firm, one through a third-party service typically used for pre-purchase due diligence. He'd also had a conversation, which Frank found through a contact in the Boston real estate scene, with an estate liquidation company about the potential timeline for selling an Adirondack Lake property following an owner's death. Following an owner's death. I read that phrase 3 times, sitting in my kitchen with morning coffee, the wood stove clicking behind me, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, something colder. The kind of clarity I used to get before walking into a difficult case. Mark wasn't just opportunistic. He'd been planning. I called Marcus Webb that afternoon. Marcus had handled my legal affairs for 17 years and had known Ellen personally. He wasn't a dramatic man, which made his tone on the phone tell me more than his words. He confirmed that about 3 weeks before my fall, a man identifying himself as Mark Shaw had called his office and, as Lucy's husband, asked whether he could get a summary of my current estate arrangements. Marcus had declined and noted the call. He hadn't told me at the time because he thought it was within the range of what an anxious son-in-law might do. "Do you still think that?" I asked. Pause. "No," Marcus said. "I do not." We talked for 40 minutes. When I hung up, I had a plan. Here's something I want you to understand about the next 3 weeks. I didn't confront Mark. I didn't warn Lucy. I didn't call the police yet because what I had was compelling but circumstantial. A shove no one saw, financial research any ambitious man might do, and a phone call that was aggressive but not illegal. The fracture in my arm was healing. The evidence was still assembling itself. I've seen too many cases fall apart because someone acted on emotion instead of timing. So I behaved normally. I answered Lucy's calls. I sent Mark a friendly text, thanking him for carrying my bag the morning of the fall. I told them both I was healing well and looking forward to having them for Thanksgiving, which we'd planned to hold at the lake house. What I didn't tell them was that I'd also called my nephew, a 44-year-old litigation attorney named Brian, and asked him to come for Thanksgiving, or that I'd updated my estate documents with Marcus Webb so that it was legally impossible for Mark to benefit from my death under any ordinary circumstance, or that the cameras had already recorded 2 phone conversations Mark had during a brief visit in early December, conversations with a business partner named Greg Sutter about the Vermont situation and what Mark called the old man's stubbornness about the property. I listened to those recordings twice. Then I sent copies to Frank, to Marcus, and to Brian. On the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, Brian drove up from New York. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours going through everything. The recordings, the title searches, the ER report, the lawyer's inquiry, Frank's documentation. Brian was quiet most of the time, taking notes on a yellow legal pad in the small, precise handwriting of someone trained not to waste words. When I finished, he looked up. "You know this is assault," he said. "The staircase." "I know." "And the recordings are clean. New York is one-party consent. You were present in the home." Frank confirmed the legality before installation. Brian set his pen down. "Uncle Jack," he said, "I think we need to make some calls before tomorrow." I nodded. "I already have." Thanksgiving morning was cold and clear, the kind of morning that makes the lake look like hammered silver. I was up at 5:30 making pie crust. Ellen always said I did it better than she did, though I never fully believed her. I'd invited 4 people beyond Brian, my neighbors, David and Rachel Park, who'd come to my Thanksgiving for 6 years, my old Seattle colleague Mike Sorensen, who happened to be in town visiting his son, and a woman named Alice Crane, who was Marcus Webb's associate and who would be, though no one else in the room knew it, a legal witness to whatever happened next. Lucy and Mark arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Mark carried wine and a pie from a Boston bakery, the kind of gesture designed to look generous while requiring no real effort. He was in good spirits. He hugged Lucy in the front hallway in a way that seemed, as always, more performant than tender. He looked around my house with those contractor eyes. "Place looks great, Jack," he said. "Thank you," I said. "Come in." The afternoon moved slowly, the way holiday afternoons do when everyone is being careful. The Parks arrived at 3 and brought warmth with them. Mike shook Mark's hand and said nothing I hadn't coached him to say. Alice Crane accepted a glass of wine and positioned herself near the bookshelf in the living room with the ease of someone who'd spent years being unobtrusive in important rooms. We sat down to dinner at 5. I carried the turkey from the kitchen to the table carefully, my ribs still tender, the brace still visible on my left forearm. I'd kept it on deliberately. Mark looked at my arm, then at Lucy, with a small private smile. "Dad's doing so much better," Lucy said brightly to the table. "He's been so tough about the whole thing." She looked at Mark with the expression of a woman managing 2 conversations at once. "Mark was so worried when it happened." "I'll bet he was," Mike said pleasantly. I caught Alice Crane pressing her lips together. Mark set down his fork. His voice was easy, relaxed, the voice of a man who believes he's in a room he controls. "I've said it before," he said. "Those stairs are a liability. A property like this needs updating, or it becomes a problem." He looked at me. "I keep telling Lucy, at your age, a fall like that could have been a lot worse. At your age." There it was again. I looked at him across the table and held his gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. Then I smiled. "You're right," I said. "It could have been a lot worse." He smiled back. 20 minutes later, during the clearing of the first course, Mark in the kitchen refilling his wine, Lucy in the bathroom, the room loose with that post-appetizer feeling. The front doorbell rang. I stood up. "I'll get it." I opened the door. 2 county sheriff's deputies stood on my front porch. Behind them, in a plain dark coat, was a detective named Leonard Reyes, whom Brian had been working with for the previous 48 hours. The cold air came in around them. "Mr. Brennan," Detective Reyes said. "Is Mark Shaw on the premises?" "He is," I said. "Come in." Come. What happened next took about 4 minutes and felt both very fast and very slow at the same time. Mark came out of the kitchen with his wine glass and stopped in the hallway at the sight of 3 law enforcement officers standing in my entrance. His face went through rapid expressions, confusion, recognition, then a particular stillness I'd seen before on other people in other circumstances. It meant the same thing it always meant. The calculation had just failed. "Mark Shaw," Detective Reyes said. "Yes." Mark's voice was careful. "Sir, we have a warrant for your arrest for aggravated assault and fraudulent misrepresentation related to an estate matter in this county. Please set down your glass and put your hands where I can see them." Lucy had come out of the bathroom and was standing at the edge of the dining room. She looked at her husband, then at me, then at her husband again. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out, and I remember thinking she looked very young in that moment, the way she'd looked at 9 years old, when she first understood that the world doesn't always behave the way you expect it to. Mark set his wineglass on my hallway table with the slow deliberateness of a man buying time. Then he looked at me. "Jack," he said. His voice had gone quiet, stripped of performance. "Careful," I said. They took him through my front door in handcuffs while the November cold rushed in, and the candles on my Thanksgiving table flickered from the draft. Alice Crane was already on her phone. Brian had stood up and was walking toward the hallway. Rachel Park put her hand over her mouth. David just sat very still. the way men of a certain age sit still when they understand they're witnessing the end of something. Lucy stood at the edge of the dining room for a long time after the door closed. I went to her. I put my good arm around her, and I felt her start to shake. She didn't cry immediately. She just stood there shaking, looking at the front door. "Dad," she finally said. It was the only word she managed for a while. "I know," I said. We sat down. I sent our guests home with kindness and genuine thanks. Alice stayed briefly to go over practical matters with Brian. Mike shook my hand at the door and said, "Hell of a Thanksgiving, Jack," which almost made me laugh. When everyone was gone, Lucy and I sat at the kitchen table with what remained of the pie and 2 cups of coffee, and I told her everything: the stairs, the cameras, the title searches, the recordings, the call to Marcus. I didn't soften it or pace it carefully. She deserved the full weight of it. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because she was my daughter and she was 41 years old, and she needed to understand exactly who she'd been living with. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked down at her coffee cup for a long time. "I didn't know," she said. "I believe you," I said. And I did. She stopped. Then, "Why didn't you tell me after the stairs? Why did you wait?" I thought about how to answer. In my professional life, I would have said, "Because premature disclosure compromises the investigation." But she wasn't a client. She was my daughter, sitting in her mother's kitchen. So I told her the truth. "Because I wasn't sure how much you already knew," I said. "And I needed to be certain before I broke your heart." Her face crumpled then. She cried the way people cry when they're grieving. Not just what happened, but what they'd believed. I sat with her. I didn't tell her everything would be fine, because I wasn't sure of that. And Ellen always said I was a poor liar about the things that mattered. I just sat with her, my arm around her, while the wood stove ticked and the lake outside went dark. There's a version of this story where I tell you everything resolved cleanly. Mark went to prison. Lucy found peace. The lake house went back to being just a place where I drank coffee and watched the water. The truth is messier and slower, the way real consequences always are. Mark's lawyer negotiated. The assault charge, my fall on the stairs, held up because of the camera Frank had installed above the staircase. It had captured Mark's hand on my back with enough clarity that no jury would have needed a second look. The fraudulent misrepresentation charge related to his contact with my estate attorney, and his talks with the liquidation firm got reduced in the final arrangement, but it stayed on his record. He served 8 months. He lost his real estate license. He and Lucy were divorced before the next Thanksgiving. Lucy and I talked often in the months that followed. Sometimes on the phone. Sometimes she drove up, and we sat on the dock with coffee in the early evening. She went through stages I recognized from people I'd watched endure hard things: anger, disbelief, a period of terrible embarrassment that I tried to help her move past. Then gradually something harder and clearer emerged underneath. She wasn't the same person she'd been. I don't think that's entirely a loss. Some of the softness she lost was naivete. And naivete, in my experience, is a kindness the world tends to take back. Eventually, she started asking me about my old cases, not the sad ones, which I kept mostly to myself, but the others. The ones where someone ordinary had done something extraordinarily patient and intelligent to protect themselves or the people they loved. She was interested in those. I think she was trying to learn something. I let her. On the last evening of the year, just before midnight, Lucy sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Are you ever going to repaint that dock?" "Every summer I intend to," I said. "I could help in the spring," she said. "I'd like that," I said. Outside, the lake was frozen solid, and the sky above the hills had the particular dark blue of a winter night just before it turns. In a few minutes it would be a new year. The wood stove was running, and the house smelled of pine and old wood and the remains of the coffee we'd been drinking for the past hour. Ellen had loved this house in a way I understood better now than I had when she was alive. It wasn't the square footage or the property value or any of the things Mark's eyes had measured that first time he walked through the door. It was the fact that she had chosen it. that it held the shape of choices made by people who had loved each other. That was the thing Mark could never have taken from me, no matter how hard he pushed. And in the end, watching my daughter look out at the frozen lake with her coffee cup held in both hands, I thought that was the only thing that had ever mattered.